And let's see, I haven't started grading the George Grosz papers, but those are some of my favorite things to read is what you all wrote about George Grosz. So I'm gonna be starting to read those this week. I'm basically I have like 10 more essays from another class to grade before I can get to George Grosz. So give me a little bit of more time with that. But just a reminder that that everybody got comments for the true crime papers. And if anybody wasn't able to see the comments, just let me know. You can send me a private message right now, or you can send me a quick email. That's the easiest way for me to not forget to send you those comments. Is if you send me an email, and then I can download your paper with my comments and then attach it to the email. It's super easy, so please don't hesitate to ask me. It's not an annoyance or anything like that. So a little bit of a change in programming because I've been looking ahead. We're in week 7 and our spring break comes right after week 9. Right after week 9. So I want to make sure that that we get everything I want to get to in the World War II unit before then, because after our spring break, we're going to start studying the history of 1968, right? And looking more at state violence versus like basically protesting communities. So there, I might have to cut some and move things around so that we round out World War II. So for today, I'm going to focus on the issue of rape and sexual assault and comparing the Eastern Front and the Western Front in Europe, because that's what your reading discussion is about. But I will come back to Nanking. I'm also going to be attending a lecture by an expert on war in the Pacific. So I'm hoping to be able to bring some of that information when I get back to Nanking to lecturing on Nanking. But how did you all do with the Atina Grossman reading? Feel free to tell me it was hard. I expect some of that.
It was a little different. It was a little difficult to read. I mean, any kind of like academia is always a little hard to read because there's like these, I don't want to call them fancy words because it makes me sound dumb, but like there's words on there that I have to like use the dictionary to figure out what to mean. But it wasn't too hard. I mean, for me personally, it wasn't super hard to understand. But
it was difficult but manageable.
Yeah, difficult but manageable. It was dense. There's a lot of information in there.
It is. It's very dense. That's why I wanted to make sure that we had enough time today to talk about it. Katie, were you going to add something? Or did I just didn't see your mic off, so.
Yeah. I always forget to turn my mic off. Sorry.
No problem. You don't have any noise in the background, so you're good. Somebody else was going to say something. I see some people in the chat saying it was very difficult, and that's okay. I expect that it would be a difficult read, and that's why we're going to talk about it.
I think it was a really good choice for an article because it really didn't get too extremely graphic. Yeah. I think that it easily could have been, but I think it did a pretty good job giving agency while not, becoming a complete horror story of just like, oh, here's these horrible things happening, and here's another one, and here's another one. It actually took its time to, I don't know, be nuanced about everything, I guess.
And that is something hard to do because when we're looking at things that are, so horrific, it's really easy to just like melt into the horrors. Brian? Is that a hand?
I found it, the article, I think another aspect of the article interesting is the author made it like very apparent that she was not like letting off, Germans or like Nazis off the hook for because, the German women that were being raped during this time by the Soviet Union, they are victims, but the author was not conflicted, but she made the point that like, they're victims, but we're not letting them off the hook for the genocide. For the genocide and all this other stuff. Especially, I think it mentioned that, by a certain time in Germany, like later into World War II, like there was a good amount of people that knew what was going on in the I'm not sure if I read that right, but yeah, it's basically like it's not letting them off the hook, but it is, it's being honest, they are victims of sexual assault, no matter what they knew or didn't know.
Yeah, and as Susana's bringing up, it's the political implications a lot of how this is handled, not of the some of it is the political implications of the experience, but the political implications of how do you handle it when there are mass numbers of rapes, right? It's one thing for individuals to report rape. They can be handled a little bit differently than when there are mass rapes and they're just like and such large scale that they can't be ignored, but there's an element of we want to ignore it. So let me back up a little bit before we get more. You're going to have I want to hear more of what you thought as you were reading it. But I do want to give you a little bit of background, especially talking about comparing what was happening in terms of both consensual sex and rape in the Eastern and the Western fronts, because this is one of the things that really stands out, just the differences in the way that these that sex and rape were experienced and punished in both fronts of the war. So first you need to know what's happening in the Western Front in France. So on September 3rd, 1939, France and Britain declared war on Germany, right? This is the beginning of the war with the invasion of Poland. This is right after the invasion of Poland. That's where the Allies had drawn the line. They had told Hitler, if you invade Poland, we will go to war to defend Poland. And he did, he invaded Poland. And so war begins. But there is a period from 1939, September 1939, until May of 1940, in which nothing happens in the Western Front, right? They're moving into Poland, the Nazis are, and they are, you know, establishing the ghettos, and they're treating the Polish population extremely harshly. They are killing elites and putting Polish Jews into ghettos. So, but in the Western Front, there's nothing happening, right? France is waiting for an invasion by the Germans. So they're mobilizing for war, but there's no actual fighting in France yet, right? The other problem here, when it comes to France, is that they've actually, in the interwar period, had been building up fortifications on the border between France and Germany, because they expected that if there was another war, that Germany would invade via that direct, you know, border between France and Germany. Of course, we know that Germany did not take that route. They had already not taken that route. Germany invades France through the Low Countries, right? I'll show you a map in a second. In the meantime, there are British and French troops that are up in the French-Belgium border, right, in case the Nazis took that route. But most of the French troops were at what is known as the Maginot Line, right? The Maginot Line is this line of fortifications that had been built in the interwar periods, because this is the border, right? This is the main border with Germany. And so really, if you want to invade France for Germany, this is the most direct route right here. But this is also the expected line, right? If you want to surprise France, you're not going to go this route. Instead, what the Germans do is they go through the Low Countries up here, so basically through Belgium and into northern France, right? In addition, there's this chunk of land here that doesn't get any fortifications and gets very few troops get sent here because this is thick forest. So the French thought that this was just a natural defense here of the Ardennes. And again, big mistake. This is a huge strategic mistake by the part of France and in Britain, because although they put some troops up here, half their forces are over here, and the Germans are not manifesting this way. They're coming up here, right? So what happens? Some of you know what happens here when the Germans attack via Belgium into France. Anyone want to give us a quick summary?
They went around it and got fucked.
Basically, the troops that are up here, there was a combination of British and French troops over here. They just are not enough to stop the German attack. So the Germans just basically start moving unstopped through northern France, making their way to Paris. And it becomes clear very soon that they're not going to be stopped before they get to Paris. And so there's a mass exodus, a huge movement of people out of northern France, out of Paris, trying to make their way out. It was such a huge movement of people all of a sudden that the roads get clogged and people end up having to just leave their cars on the road and end up walking out of Paris to try to find, if they had relatives in southern France, try to find relatives, or just trying to find anything where they can escape the Nazi invasion, right? Hitler does make his way to France, and so Paris becomes occupied, right? He actually ends up making this night visit to Paris on June 14, 1940. And it's always a picture that creeps me out, because if you ever go to France, this is the exact same picture you will take. You're literally, this is what every tourist goes and does when they go see the Eiffel Tower, right? It goes to the pavilion, takes a picture with the Eiffel Tower in the background. And here he is with the Eiffel Tower there. But it's a brilliant piece of propaganda, because what message does this send to the world?
The Nazis have already taken over France very quickly.
Yeah, for both Che and Katie. What were you saying, Katie? Say it again.
I said, ha ha, we got France. Yes. I see London. I see France, now I see London, and soon I shall see your underpants.
Basically, yes. And so this tells the world they cannot be stopped, right? They were not stopped at Poland. They are not stopped even by France, right? And so this is a huge victory for Hitler, even though the French didn't put up much of a fight here. Now, there is still something the French could have done. Half their troops were at the Maginot Line, right? So they could have, regrouped. They could have used the colonies as a base to fight the occupation, but they don't do that. They don't do that. And we end up with a divided France, right? The northern part of France, all this green area, is directly occupied by German forces, right? It's military occupation of northern France. All this green area is directly controlled by the German military. But in the south of France, we get something really unique in terms of occupied territory, territory occupied by the Nazis. The Germans allow the French to create a new government in the south, the capital of which was at Vichy. That's why historians call this Vichy France. It's the Vichy government during the occupation, where they are given a lot of independence. Ultimately, the French officials of Vichy France had a lot of freedom. They do answer to the Nazi government, but the Nazi government just pretty much let them go about their business, right? So these are key moments here, that France falls to the Germans and they create Vichy France. There's very little opposition to the creation of this government in the south of France, even though it is a collaboration government, right? This is a Vichy government will work with the Nazis. Why do you think there's so little resistance to the creation of this and to collaboration with the Nazi regime? Why don't people just fight back, fight against Vichy, fight against the Nazis? Why do they choose to collaborate?
I don't know, Dr. Coronado, maybe to maintain that French identity and to be on good terms, because of I imagine maybe, this part of France was already perhaps free of Jewish population, or
not yet, not yet, but but part of it is okay. The Nazis seem unstoppable, especially once they're occupying Paris, and the idea is we can work with them. We can work with them to try to save some part of France. But Che, were you going to add something?
I was just thinking because of how Germany showed their power by taking France extremely quickly, the French kind of knew that they were not in a position where they could be like, oh yeah, we'll be fighting back right now. They needed to kind of wait a while because this is pre-Operation Barbarossa. So, I mean, Poland was split up. Yeah, Germany attacked Poland, but guess what? So did the Soviet Union. And
Yeah,
you
they
have
ended up dividing it.
right now Germany's really looking strong until the Allies get more allies. They won't really be as powerful. So I think France kind of needs to at this point just be like, all right, we kind of submit
Yeah,
because we will just keep on losing at
and
this
they
point.
do. Actually, for the Vichy government, this is the French government, Vichy France, they never have any plans to ever resist the Nazi regime. They don't. But part of it is they see the strength of the Germans and they are trying to avoid the horrors of World War One. World War One was still very much in everybody's mind in France, and they were trying to avoid that. And the French believed that if they can work with the Germans, they would be able to get better outcomes, essentially. There is some immediate resistance to the Nazi regime. Charles de Gaulle is one of the few people who automatically calls for a resistance to the Vichy regime and a resistance to Nazi occupation. But Charles de Gaulle was a minor general in the French army. Most people had never heard of Charles de Gaulle. And so he gets given a position by the Allies. He ends up being in London, and FDR and Churchill declare him the leader of the Free French, and he declares himself the leader of the Free French, but he's a nobody, and very few people are even listening to his calls for resistance. Most people are actually in favor of the Vichy regime, in part because the leader of the Vichy regime was Charles Pétain. And Pétain was a World War I hero, extremely well respected. Everybody knew him and they trusted him. They trust that if he's going along with this, it's to help French people. Now, from the Nazi perspective, they're allowing this to happen. They allow the French to create a government, an independent government in the south of France, because they don't want to have to deal with all of what it takes to occupy the southern part. They want to occupy Paris and this northern half, but they're okay giving the French a lot of leeway here, in large part because the racial attitudes towards the French is that they're part of the Aryan family, right? They're not equal to Germans. German Aryans were at the top of the hierarchy, but the Germans did see the French as Aryans who had been corrupted, right? So they're not pure Aryans, but they can be rehabilitated, right? If they can be redeemed and welcomed back into the Aryan family. Essentially, these are white people that have taken some wrong turns, but we can work with them. We can make them part of the Aryan family was the idea, right? Obviously, not everybody in France, the Jewish population will not be considered under this ideology, but in terms of non-Jewish France, they can work with it, right? They are extremely delusional as fuck. Yeah, this should sound crazy ideology, but this is how they're looking at it. So in terms of what we see in terms of sex and even rapes in France, there are long periods in which Germany is occupying France, in which because there's not a strong resistance at first. German troops in France are not experiencing battle. When you read the letters of German soldiers that were stationed in France, they are acting like tourists. They are going to see the Eiffel Tower. They're going to go see the museums. They're actually very upset because a lot of the museums had been cleared out of their most important artwork because they didn't want it destroyed by the Nazis. But the Germans are basically like having fun in France, right? Brothels are set up for the German military here, and there is a a large number of consensual, romantic, and sexual relationships between German soldiers and French women. Right? Just a lot. In fact, that becomes an issue at the end of the war because the women that end up having these relationships with the German men are viewed as collaborationists. Right? It's called horizontal collaboration. And they will be seen as traitors at the end of the world, but at the end of the war. But during the war, while the occupation is going on, there's lots of relationships here, and the German military is encouraging that. They're encouraging German soldiers to form attachments to the French women. There's absolutely no problem there. There are instances of rape of French women by German soldiers in France, and those instances are not tolerated, right? When a rape is reported to the German military, the soldiers will be punished. They might, the level of punishment can vary, but there is punishment. Military authorities in France take those rape accusations seriously. They take them seriously. That is going to be a huge contrast to what we see in the Eastern Front. Right. So moving to the Eastern Front, then Germany does, always had plans not just to invade Poland, but to move on to the Soviet Union. There, Hitler and the Soviets had made a pact, but it was an extremely temporary pact. Both sides knew that eventually they would go to war because their interests in Eastern Europe were going to clash. Both the Germans and the Soviets wanted control over Eastern Europe. The Germans believe that the war with the Soviets is going to take weeks. They think it's going to be a really quick war in the Eastern Front. That's why actually after the invasion of France goes so well, Hitler had turned to Britain with the Blitz. That was not going well. So Hitler had decided to put a hold on Britain. He's like, we're going to come back to Britain, but let's take out the Soviet Union first because they're going to be easier to take down. So because the war is supposed to end by the summer, the Germans make zero preparations for a prolonged war during the winter with the Soviet Union. Why? Why do they think that the Soviets are going to be so easy to take out? Why do they make no preparations? It makes no sense that they don't do any preparations at all, even as backup plans. But why don't they?
They're very cocky.
Hitler figured if he attacked them, the surprise attack would go a lot smoother.
Yeah, that a surprise attack would go smoother. They weren't surprised, by the way, by the fact that that the British were holding on, right? That the Blitz hadn't really worked because they're thinking, well, the British are white, right? They're Aryan, so of course they're going to put up more of a fight. So the idea was that he was going to turn to the Soviet Union, and because the Soviet Union was seen as ethnic Slavs and therefore racially inferior, that's why they were going to be so easy to take out. He thinks those are racially inferior people who will not be able to put up a fight against German forces.
Really? That was his reasoning?
That was part of the reasoning. Yeah, that's a big part of the reasoning.
Yeah, I think ideology in general was just like a big, huge flaw in, just Nazi planning and warfare. Like a lot of stuff was just based on ideology, which leads to a lot of failure.
Yes, this is a huge mistake. I mean, to not even do any backup plans here because of the racial thing is just super incorrect, right? And so Operation Barbarossa is the invasion of the Soviet Union, which begins in June 22nd, 1941. This is an escalation of war because, they did not learn from Napoleon at all. Orders are given to the German military to kill all officers and to kill all political enemies on sight. They really don't want to be taking prisoners of war in the Soviet Union. They don't want to have to deal with, housing the prisoners of war, feeding the prisoners of war. These are, because in their mind, these are ethnically inferior people. Let's just kill them all. Right? Anybody in uniform is to be treated ruthlessly, but the civilian population as well. Right? The civilian population is to be treated ruthlessly. If the German military is walking through a town, through a field, whatever food is there belongs to the German army. Right? And so a couple of things happening here. This is a strategy of a war of total annihilation in the Soviet Union, right? Of not taking prisoners, treating civilian and military personnel ruthlessly. And at the same time, I just want to remind you that this is soon afterwards, the decision for the final solution will be made. So they decide that the way to deal with the Jewish population of Europe is to murder them, to kill them. Right? Within this ideology, then, because these racial prejudices are so strong, what we see kind of makes sense that in France, right, relationships between the German soldiers and the French women are encouraged. In the Eastern Front, they're not doing that. They're not going to do that. Right? I'll come to that in a second. So Operation Barbarossa here, the invasion of the Soviet Union, initially is extremely successful. He actually is able to take the Soviets by surprise, and the German forces move unstopped for a large chunk here. It's not until German forces make it to Leningrad, Moscow and Stalingrad that the Germans are finally stopped. So they begin marching into the Soviet Union unstopped. Now, the Soviet population doesn't panic, mostly because the Soviets are really good at controlling the information that so the Soviet population receives, but they're not stopped until they reach basically this light blue dotted line here. Right? In the meantime, as the German forces are making their way through the Soviet Union, there's a significant number of rapes, just large number of rapes of Soviet women. Right? And I want to make it clear that when we're talking about these rapes, the issue is not sex, right? I mean, even in the Soviet Union, the German authorities try to create brothels for the German soldiers. So it's not about soldiers not having sexual partners. It's about power. I mean, it's about power in any situation, but especially here, it's just very clearly about power and about rape being a tool that the German military is using, right? Because at first, the sex was banned. Like even the rapes, like the German authorities don't want it happening. They don't want German soldiers have any sexual contact with Soviet women. Why? Why wouldn't they want any sexual contact between the German soldiers and the Soviet women?
Probably thought of it as impure.
Yes, because these are racially inferior women, and they don't want even the potential of children of being resulting out of this. And so at first they try to ban it, but you can't really ban it. I mean, they weren't able to control it. And so initially or after that, they try to set up brothels. They're also concerned with venereal disease, but they're actually much more worried that the German soldiers will form attachments to the Soviet women, that they might fall in love. They are also wanting to control some of the rapes because they're afraid of the breakdown of discipline within the army. Right? So they try to set up brothels. They try to pick, actually, the women that they force into the brothels. They try to pick women that are mixed race, more ethnic, so that they are a little bit better than just Slavic women, which is a really bizarre thing to say. Like, hey, we don't want you having sex with the Soviet racially inferior women, but we're going to find you some women that are maybe more acceptable, racially acceptable. Either way, even the brothels, though, don't stop the mass number of rape of Soviet women. Right? There were cases of like accusations of rape in the military, right? So military authorities are forced to examine some of these accusations of rape. They do go through the process on some of them, but it was very rare after the invasion of the Soviet Union to have any German soldier prosecuted for rape in the Eastern Front. It was rare. When they are prosecuted, it's very rare that they get found guilty. But there are some cases in which some German soldiers are found guilty of rape in the Eastern Front, and they get very light sentences. Usually they get a fine. They get a fine and nothing else. And so the rapes continue. They just continue in the Eastern Front. Let me see, what are the questions in the comment? Was there ever a moment where these German soldiers thought these racial ideologies were too extreme? Not really. So actually, Tina Grossman herself has written a book about this, in which she interviewed a lot of veterans of the war, and they talk about how the men talk about not being able to speak up if everybody else in around them was doing it, but they basically first felt forced to because like peer pressure. They felt the peer pressure to rape, and because everybody was taking part of it, like there was that idea that like, okay, even if you don't want to do it, your men, your army buddies are forcing you to do it because they want everybody to do it, and no one being able to accuse anybody else. Not a very satisfying answer, but it's what the men themselves said about it. So this, when I said it was used as a weapon of war, right? What I mean by that is that it was a form of conquest. The rapes were a form of conquest. It was a way to signal to the Soviet men, this is how weak you are. You are so weak that you cannot protect your women. Right? And we're showing you that through the rapes. That aspect of it is not unique to the situation, but it is very clearly being used here as a way to send a message. Yes, to emasculate them, and the idea was that to bring down morale amongst the Soviet troops so that they will give in.
Dr. Cardona, may I ask something?
Yeah.
Like, I think perhaps that, because like when I was reading this article, you know, I was getting all these crazy ideas and making like brief correlations with other events, and like I feel like perhaps because I think I remember speaking on this in one of your other courses, where like, you know, it's a lot less about you know, sex, right, and it's more about power. Yeah. You know, displaying that sense of you know, a strength, and you know, like you're gonna listen to us, right?
Yes, and of like that you are so like, this is how much you have been defeated, and using female bodies to send these messages, right? Why are the rapes? Why are they using rapes of women to do this? Well, it's how they're. It's like the message is through these female bodies, and nothing can be done. Was the idea, right? This is how defeated you have been. There's nothing you can do about it. And then the women that are caught in the middle, like, too bad. That was the idea. That was the idea. So this is the mass rapes of the Soviet women by the Germans. Then we get to what Tina Grossman is talking about. She's talking about the rape of German women by the Soviet soldiers. So once the Soviets turn the war around. It takes a while, right? It takes a while, but the Soviets are able to then begin pushing the Germans out of the Soviet Union, right? Let me go back to the map. So that might be a better visual. And here, so the Soviets hold the line at Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, and then once they, beyond just holding, they're able to regroup and begin pushing the Germans back out of the Soviet Union and back out, right? Once that begins happening, when it is clear that the Germans will be driven out, right? And that the Soviets are moving towards Germany, German women know what's coming, right? I think that's one of the things that Tina Grossman talks about. People knew that there was gonna be instances of mass rape in Germany by Soviet soldiers, right? That it was.
State knew as well, right? They try to set up resources. The state, the German state knew as well that there was going to be like a wave of sexual assaults coming, so they try to set up like resources for German women.
Yes, you have stories of German women trying to cut their hair, dirty up their faces, try to look like boys, try to hide, basically, because they knew that everybody knew about the rapes in the Soviet Union, right? This was not something that was hidden, right? People knew that those rapes had occurred, and so they knew that when the Soviets marched into Germany, that there was going to be backlash for the rape of the Soviet women, that they were going to rape German women. And so some women tried to hide, to do what they could, and that, I mean, that did not stop the rapes from happening. And once again, Tina Grossman has interviewed Soviet soldiers, and they were, to me, surprisingly, had no problem getting some of those interviews. If you're interested, you should look up the other books that Tina Grossman has written. But she was surprisingly had a lot of access to veterans of the war, and is able to get these men to just talk about what they did and why they did what they did. A lot of them talk about, that peer pressure once again, as everybody else is doing it, about payback. They talk about payback. They talk about this was behavior that was not them. A lot of them say, it was not me. Yeah, I did that, but I would have never done that outside of war. If I had not been a soldier in this war, I would have never done that. In terms of explanation, I find those explanations incredibly unsatisfying, but that is what they said, right, when they were interviewed afterwards. What Tina Grossman is giving us here, though, is more of the stories of the German women. Right? Because those are rare to find. Right? It's actually rare to get the stories from the Soviet women that were raped. It's hard to get the stories of the German women. And she says this case of the German women is different than just, oh, here's another instance of men using women's bodies to send each other messages, right? Why does she say what makes the context of Germany different than other instances? What makes the context there different? Did anybody catch that in the reading?
I'm sorry, Dr. Cardone, you mind repeating that?
Yeah, so Tina Grossman is telling us, she's able to get some of these stories of the German women and telling their experience of rape, but she also wants to argue that this is not just another case of rape in the middle of a war, that the context here is different, right? So what makes this case unique or different than other cases of women being raped in the middle of a war?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I feel like I'm a bit like out of left field here, Dr. Cardone, but like I think I remember reading just the fact of like, a lot of it had to do with like, I guess abortions, right? And just saying like, oh, a lot of these women, they wanted to get rid of just this reality of being attacked, and so they had to provide an idea of they had to provide like a message of what had occurred, why I'm getting this procedure, and it all displays on that sense of power and violence. And so it was also impacting because of like historians, right, of like this time currently the 21st century, they well, I mean, I don't know what century per se, right, but like they argue that like that this is like a continuation of German and Nazi ideology of superiority, right? They wanted to do this, but it's like no. I feel like the author was saying like no, like this was just like these women wanted to get rid of like any remembrance of this attack.
Yeah, so that's going to be an important factor, the abortions here. And let's come back to that. But Brian, what did you want to add something? Or is the hand just up from last time? Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, doesn't this like?
Ooh, Brian, you keep cutting off.
The reason is that oh, sorry. Am I coming in now?
Yes.
I'm, like, in a bad connection zone.
We can hear you now.
Germany's history.
Mm-hmm.
Germany's history in the war. I mean, Germany's role in the war. All the rapes and all the destruction that they caused.
Yeah. So that is
makes it a little different.
Yeah, that is part of what makes the situation different, right? So we're moving really fast today over the course of the war. At the very end of the war, right? Germany is an occupied country. It is occupied by all of the Allied powers. Right? They all have a chunk of Germany, and it makes it different than the cases in the Soviet Union and the cases in Nanking, or the instances of rape by the Japanese military. Right, this is an occupied country, and the rapes are happening in the context of that occupation. And the reason that matters is because if the German women wanted to report the rapes, who would they be reporting it to? They would be reporting it to the same authorities that are committing the rapes. Right? How do you report that a Soviet soldier raped you to Soviet authorities? That was just very difficult. I mean, instances of rape are hard to report to begin with, but when you're reporting it to the same people who are committing the rapes, it makes it that much harder, right? And there were instances of rape by all of the Allied military forces in Germany, but the largest number were done by Soviet soldiers, and in Soviet occupied Germany, that just was that much harder to report. The other factor is, once the occupation of Germany begins and all the information about the concentration camps and genocide comes out, the story about Germany and their actions during the war becomes all about genocide, right? The Germans are the bad guys. It's clear. There's like no black and white. Genocide bad, and the Germans did it. Right? In some way or another, every person in Germany collaborated to some extent, and therefore that made the Germans all bad. In that context, and even though the rapes of German women are happening at a large scale, the Allies don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about Germans being the victims of anything, right? The focus is the Germans as the perpetrators of genocide. Yeah, so Hugo, that's what you had put in the chat. Yeah, they are the ones who allowed or actually performed the genocide. Therefore, they cannot be the victims. And that means then that for historians, even in the late 20th century and 21st century, it's really hard to be more nuanced there and to present any story of the Germans as victims. Right? That's one complication. Another complication of that setting is the fact that everybody's suffering at the end of the war, right? Everybody in Germany is suffering, right? Yes, Silkila was putting it in the chat. The story of these rapes becomes blanketed over by other suffering. So even the German women, when they are interviewed, when they're talking about their experience, they will not bring up the rape. They will talk about other suffering. They will talk about not being able to have enough food to eat, not having clothes, not being able to warm their homes. They're talking about other hardships. And a lot of times, even in their minds, they don't see the rapes as being like necessarily out of the ordinary, right? They're kind of repressing that experience. And instead, what comes up is all the other experiences of suffering and hardship. Right? And in that instance, then the rape gets hidden behind all the other suffering. Right? And there is a lot of the social stigma, right, of being a rape victim that a lot of these women don't want to deal with, right? If they see themselves as victims, they want to see themselves as part of the same victimhood that everybody else is suffering.
Dr. Cardano, was there also like a point where they didn't want to remember such things? Because I mean, like there was like primary accounts here like of like actual brutality, right? Like there was one story that that the author brought up about how women were like killed right after a rape, right? Like there's like a woman was mutilated, women were like mutilated and such like that. And like, so like, is there like some kind of accounts there where like, they just, it was like so brutal and so, and so intense that they don't wish to like repeat that, right? They don't want to remember that.
Yes, exactly. They don't want to repeat that. They don't want that to be, they don't want to repeat that. Let me go back to some of the questions I had on here, because all right, that kind of helps answer some of the questions from the prompt, right? Why is it so difficult to tell those stories? Well, because it's difficult to report the stories. It's occupied country. You're reporting rapes. You would be reporting rapes to the same people who are doing the rapes. It's experienced as just part of the suffering. The social stigma is a factor as well. But we do get these stories, right? Tina Grossman is able to uncover all of these stories that are actually very rare to get of women talking about their experience to some extent, right? But that is because of a very specific thing that is happening in Germany at the end of the war. And that is, okay, these quotes just come from the other thing, from the abortions. So abortion was illegal in Germany during the war, right? Abortions are illegal. They will be illegal again after the war, except for this period of time immediately after the war. For a short period of time, you can get a legal abortion in Germany if you were raped by a Soviet soldier, right? If you were raped by a Soviet. Brian, were you gonna, is that a new hand raise?
Yeah, I was gonna talk about something, but I think we passed that. So it's
okay. Let's save that somewhere. That comment somewhere. We'll come back to it. So
definitely.
The temporary legalization of abortion, and the fact that in order to get an abortion in Germany at the very end of the war here, so again, it's just for a short period of time, had to go through a commission. You had to submit a petition requesting a legal abortion, and you had to tell your story, right? What we know, what Tina Grossman tells us from having read all those petitions, is that when a woman argued that she was raped by a Soviet soldier, she would be granted the abortion. Every single woman who said she was raped by a Soviet soldier was granted access to an abortion. Right? This complicates things. This makes things complicated for historians trying to analyze these sources, because on the one hand, we know the rapes occurred. There's no question about that. That's why everybody knew that they were happening. But the fact that it was all had to go through a bureaucratic process of getting the abortion means that, these women have to tell their stories publicly. all of these petitions are a matter of public record at the time. So a woman had to declare that she had been raped publicly, right? So there would be no hiding the rape. But if she wanted an abortion, she had to do it. It also means that this could be used by other people who maybe had not been raped and just needed access to the abortion. Right? If you needed access to the abortion and you knew that the only way you would be granted the abortion would be to say that you were raped, then you were going to say that. Right? If it's the only way to get access to it, to a medical safe abortion, then you're going to do it. That means that you know, these letters, these petitions have to be approached with that in mind. Right? That's how we want to analyze them, taking into consideration that we do know these rapes happen. So we know that most of these petitions would have been truthful, but that there's also a chance that maybe in there would be some that might not have been. Right? So that's just overall one of the difficulties for historians in terms of how we read these stories. Right? Let's see, what are you saying? Well, the Jewish woman who expected liberation instead got raped, got the worst sufferings after all, like Odalis mentioned. Yeah, actually, I mean, there's no denying that. That would be absolutely true. But these petitions do tell us a bunch of really good information, right? We can't just ignore them and say, well, I don't know, maybe they can't tell us too much because these petitions were public, right? And because it was the only way to get an abortion in Germany during this time was to say that you were raped. But they actually do give us a lot of really important, solid information, right? Can anybody tell us at least one of the pieces of information we get out of these petitions? Maybe I'll share the screen again. You can read it off the slide. So one, Athena Grossman is able to categorize the petitions into different groups and based on the kind of language that they give us, right? But one of the clear things we do get out of the petitions is every single petition had to explain why they wanted the abortion. Why do you want the abortion, right? And yeah, and reasons. So what we get is very rare to have in writing, is women explaining why they want this, right? And a lot of what we find is that a lot of women, even though they are including in the petition that they were raped, they're also explaining the economic hardship of having another child. They also talk about, you know, just like they already have plenty of other children, right? Most of these women who were filing petitions to get an abortion already have children, right? Yeah. A lot of these aren't even moral or racial reasons for it. Yeah, there are things like these quotes, right? Women saying, I am pregnant due to rape by a Russian on April 27th, 1945. I request removal of the fetus since I already have an illegitimate child and live with my parents who themselves have small children. So plenty of the petitions have this kind of story, right? Or this woman from Potsdam who said, since I am single, my mother dead for 15 years, my father a half Jew from whom I have had no sign of life for 6 years. It is impossible for me to set a child into the world under these conditions. Or, you know, I have 3 children aged 5 to 11 years. My husband, a former soldier, isn't back yet. I've been bombed out twice, fled here in January from West Prussia, and now request more cordially that I be helped in preventing this latest disaster for me and my family. So a lot of them, like even Grossman, I think, remarks on how a lot of these petitions are very like matter of fact, right? Very matter of fact, right? They were raped before the first one. I think she's saying she was raped after she had an illegitimate child, and then afterwards was raped, and now is pregnant is experiencing another pregnancy, and that's the one she wants to end. So I'm like, What did you all, let me ask you, those of you who got into some of these reasons, what did you make of the matter of fact nature of some of these petitions and the wording in them?
The way I saw it, Dr. Cardona, was just like, I mean, I don't wish to be insensitive or anything, but like, it seemed like to me that, these accounts were really like straight to the point, right? There was no like, recounts of like the attack or like, yeah, it was just like, oh, this is what happened, and I wish to get this procedure done. And kind of like business, like straight to the point, I guess.
Yeah, and some of it can read like wrong and callous almost. But the thing to remember when thinking about the tone of the letters is that the women knew that they were public, right? Anybody could read it. I mean, these were public records, right? And so they wouldn't be pouring out their emotions in a public official document. But some of the letters were are very racialized. The racial language is clear. Now we're talking again at the very end of the war. So there has been no program of denazification, right? There will be denazification programs by the Allies, by the Soviets, and then the rest of the Allies. But it is clear that the Nazi racial ideologies are still there. A number of these women use Nazi language to explain why they want an abortion, right? So, for example, I hereby certify that at the end of April this year, during the Russian march into Berlin, I was raped in a loathsome way by 2 Red Army soldiers of Mongol Asiatic type. So again, that Mongol, they're not actually talking about people from Mongolia. This is a racial term to mean, these racially inferior people. It's a derogatory word at the time. So they're very much saying, they're emphasizing this is not, the child I'm carrying would be racially inferior. Any person who is not German, but pretty much. Here's another one where they give, it's still a level of matter of factness there, but emphasizing that they were raped by a racially inferior man, right? And that is present in a lot of them, right? In a lot of them. And so, I mean, like she talks about, Grossman talks about, like, as a feminist, I want to view these women as victims, and they are victims of rape, and also they are Nazis, right? It is clear in the language that some of these women have internalized Nazi ideology, that they believe Nazi ideology. What do we do with that? Can Nazis be victims?
It depends what you believe in.
It depends on what you put. It totally depends. And this is something where I'm like,
rape is unjustifiable, point blank, period. It's the only unjustifiable crime there is. Any sort of sexual violence or molestation. No one deserves that.
No one deserves that. No,
even if you fell into the Nazi propaganda, which is the point of propaganda, is to manipulate you. And no one is immune from propaganda. We just see propaganda as something completely different, but like the James Bond movies were propaganda. You know what I mean? Like anti-Russian Soviet propaganda. So, we get it into our mentality that that all of the people who were a part of the Nazi party were, all these high up people working in concentration camps, but could just be like little Joe Baker, joined the Nazi party, making some bread, kind of believed in not liking Jews so much, just making bread, unable to act on it. You know what I mean? just being a normal.
Although the only thing I would qualify there is there's no kind of belief, but in these special ideologies, I mean, some of these people they were legitimately racist. It doesn't justify the rapes at all, but it's hard in history to present a nuanced view when you create one image of people, right? You create an image of the Germans here, and the Allies did this deliberately. The goal was for the Germans to acknowledge and pay for their crimes. Right? This is the Allies were making sure of that. This is why we have the Declaration of the Rights of Humans, human rights established at the UN. This is why we have the Nuremberg trials. All of this thing that happens at the end of the war was because the Allies made sure that the Germans would have to that there would be consequences for the genocide. The problem in history, when that is the only story you tell, is that you lose the nuance of what people's experiences were. You do lose the nuance of people's experiences. And that's why even historians have completely ignored these instances of mass rape. I mean, we're not talking about a handful of rapes, we're talking about mass rape of women. And if you want to, if you have very black and white ideas in your head, these stories will complicate them for you. Right? They will complicate them for you. Caleb's asking in the chat, what did German women think about the Nazis doing that in Soviet Union, about the rapes in the Soviet Union? Most of them would have known about that, read about it, but there would have been no objection to it. Nothing, very little voiced objection. Right? I mean, you couldn't voice an objection to what the German military was doing, or you would come under suspicion. So in terms of voiced objection, there was none recorded. Privately, there might have been some, but it was dangerous to voice any objection to it. Right? But it's clear, one of the things we get in these petitions, it's clear that Nazi language was internalized and believed. Right? That doesn't take away, though, some of the other reasons that we see in the petition, right? The social and economic reasons that we see in there. There were instances in these petitions of rapes being recorded, not by the Soviet soldiers, but by other Allied soldiers. There are instances of the women saying that they were raped by African-American soldiers. Not a lot of those, but there's a recording of it. But again, it always was in these petitions, the element of race comes up again and again. Race, in the petitions for an abortion, race was a factor, right? And again, then to add another complication is to remember that you had to say that if you wanted to be granted the petition, you had to say that. Brian? Brian, did you?
Yeah. Well, the article, I mean, it kind of, in my opinion, it challenges our idea of what a victim of sexual assault is. I mean, I don't know who said this earlier, but it's absolutely reprehensible and totally immoral. Like, there's no justification for sexual assault, and I totally agree with that. But that's an idea, that's an ideology we should like hold true in every instance of sexual assault. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's kind of hard to feel bad for a person that commits genocide or anything like that, because I mean, they hurt a lot of people, but we can't just, flip the script. If this person's been sexually assaulted, we can't flip the script and be like, oh, they were a terrible person and this terrible thing happened to them. I don't feel as bad. I think it's hard, but you have to hold that idea, that same sentiment for everyone that is a victim of sexual assault, no matter what they've done. And it's really difficult. And this article kind of like makes a point that it really challenges that idea of what a victim can be, what a victim is. And you can't, I forget who said this, but like, if you ignore it, I don't know, I'm not gonna say the quote, I don't remember it, but you can't ignore injustices and you can't cherry pick stuff.
Yeah, and that they deserve justice at the time too. They didn't get justice, right? The rapes, most of these rapes of German women were not prosecuted. There was never anything like that, and they did deserve that at the time, regardless of any other horrible thing. Probably can't and at the same time, it also doesn't undermine. I've seen some of these women as victims also doesn't undermine the responsibility um, over genocide either. I do think it's possible to see the nuance and to not justify or push away any of the bad things happening here. Yeah, and that's what I'm going to say, though, that in trying to also bring light to the situation of the rapes, we also should not excuse the way in which people collaborated either. And it's possible to not excuse anybody and still have there be justice. Justice is not easy, but it's possible here. It is possible.
It would be like a Republican woman being raped and not being able to get justice because Trump created concentration camps for illegal immigrants. Like, just because they vote him in and he does actions that nobody pays attention to doesn't mean that they're directly, participating in it or have anything to do with it. They're just racist and they believe in what Trump believes. They may even be deluded into what Trump's ideology and Trump's everything. But that doesn't change the fact that there are concentration camps in the United States right now being for illegal immigrants, and that no one's doing anything about it. We all know it's there. None of us are doing anything about it. So the question becomes, like, if this does become a thing like the Holocaust, where, Biden decides to get off his ass and go and liberate them, like, do we punish all Republicans, even Republican women who got raped because they voted for Trump and Trump did this thing? Because
let's not get too much into the modern day example, but yeah, it would not be a justification. Brian, I see your hand up. Brian?
Oh, sorry, my bad. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Did I see anybody else's hand? So that's part of why I'm bringing up these instances is because of the complexity of it, right? And because we're so used to analyzing World War II as in very black and white terms, right? We're used to being in very black and white terms, and some of these stories hopefully make you look at it in more complex ways. Hugo says, using the word Mongol doesn't sound racist to me on its own. Weren't they just trying to describe the rapist? No, that was a racial word. It was a word meant to be derogatory, and it was a racist word at the time. Now we would think, okay, they're talking about people from Mongolia, but they were not using it this way. Right? These were the soldiers that they were describing were not Mongolian. Right? They were not. They were using it as a racial slur. At the time, that was common. That it would have been used that way. So yeah, it doesn't sound to us because that word is not. It was not necessarily used in the U.S. and it's not a modern day term. But at the time in Germany, it was a very common racist word at the time. Yeah. And see that word, Caleb, that you're putting in there, it's not something a lot of us have even heard, right? Unless you're talking about some of the racial dynamics happening in Eastern Europe, you would not have heard that word. But it would have been, yeah, in the propaganda pictures that you see, in the way that people into the east of Germany were depicted, was extremely racist. How Jews were depicted, all of that, and that, so that, yeah, absolutely, that's there. So let me take a look one more time and see about, oops, go back to the discussion questions that I'm going to be asking you and make sure we've touched on all of them. Because I'm like, I'm having you write on these, and I know it's not, the reading is not easy, and so I want to give you as much information as we can. More the meaning. So when I talk about meanings, right, it's from the petitions themselves, right, to what meanings that the women give to them, right? So there you can talk about like some of the racialized elements of it, but same for number 5. This is what I was talking about just in this last moment about how in a lot of the petitions, we find economic reasons, social reasons, the idea of I already have a ton of children, my husband's not back from the war, there's a lot of hardship and I can't handle another child, right? Those are all key characteristics that Grossman finds in the petitions themselves, right? And when I'm talking here, according to Grossman, what was the experience of rape here? You know, I don't need details. She doesn't get, you know, I mean, in the petitions themselves, the women don't get into a lot of details of it. What I mean there is, you know, the not voicing it. Women not telling the stories, not telling authorities, not reporting the rapes to authorities, and sometimes even family members would not have known. Right, that's what I mean there. But are there any questions? Some of you have, I know some of you have already been looking at the discussion questions in it, or anything that you highlighted in the reading that I haven't yet touched on. I think there's a few things in there I have not touched on yet. Or anything else that stood out to you in the reading?
Yeah, Dr. Cardona, I mean, really quickly, if I may, just like on page 45, it says something about how, right, I could read it here. It says, I quickly underlined it. It said, participate in a dangerous revival of German nationalism, whitewash the Nazi past, and normalize a genocidal war. I wrote a question here like, this is like, is the story of these Nazi women rapes being buried in a way to like not renationalize Germany per se?
Yes, in a way. The idea was, you know, that the Germans don't get to be victims here in any way, shape, or form, because that could lead to, you know, this nationalistic ideas that led to the Nazis, and the idea was to cleanse it of all of that.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Cardona.
All right, I will end here, but I'll stop the recording, but I will stick around